The Trojan War is one of the best-known stories from the Greek world, but it survives in more than one form. The poets do not always agree on the order of events, and later retellings add details earlier sources only imply. Still, the core pattern is clear. A chain of divine disputes, broken promises, and human pride begins with the judgment of Paris and ends, after a long siege, with the destruction of Troy. The earliest surviving Greek accounts come from the epic tradition associated with Homer and the wider cycle of lost poems around the war. In those sources, the conflict is not a single duel or act of revenge. It grows from earlier choices, especially the prize offered to Paris, the abduction of Helen, and the alliance of Greek kings who swear to recover her. Once the war begins, the gods remain involved, but they do not remove human responsibility. The story moves forward because people keep making decisions, and each one narrows the path left open. Peleus and Thetis are married before the Trojan War begins, and in later Greek tradition that wedding becomes the first clear step toward the conflict. Peleus is a mortal hero, usually placed among the generation of figures who stand close to heroic myth. Thetis is a sea goddess, one of the Nereids in older tradition, and her union with a human husband carries meaning beyond a single family story. Their marriage joins mortal and divine lines, and their son will be Achilles, the greatest Greek warrior in the later war narrative. But the wedding matters for another reason as well. It is where the gods themselves begin to divide. In the traditional account, the marriage takes place before the long chain of events that leads to Troy. Later poets treat it as an important threshold. It belongs to the world before the war, but it already contains the war's logic. A banquet meant to honor a union becomes the setting for exclusion, rivalry, and judgment. Greek myth often turns such moments into turning points. A feast, a gift, or a slight can become the beginning of a larger disaster, especially when gods are involved and every honor has political weight. The split begins with Eris, the goddess of strife. In the best-known version, she is not invited to the banquet. That omission is enough to set the trouble in motion. Eris appears anyway and leaves a golden apple at the feast, marked for the fairest. This detail survives mainly in later tradition, especially in summaries and mythographic retellings, while the older epic poems do not dwell on the wedding itself in full narrative form. Even so, the image becomes fixed in Greek memory. The apple is not a harmless ornament or a simple prize. It is a challenge that turns celebration into rivalry. Once the inscription is read, the question becomes unavoidable. Which goddess is to be judged the most beautiful? And who has the right to make that judgment? Ancient sources handle the details in slightly different ways, but the main shape of the story stays the same. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite all become part of the dispute. In some tellings, they openly claim the apple. In others, the contest is implied by the logic of the scene itself. Zeus does not want to choose between them. Some versions say he refuses to decide. Others say he sends the problem elsewhere, avoiding a judgment that would offend two powerful goddesses. Either way, the outcome is the same. The question is pushed away from Olympus and into the human world, where Paris will later be asked to judge. That transfer is important. Greek myth often turns divine rivalry into human consequence. The gods do not simply observe people from a distance, they place mortals in the middle of disputes that began among themselves. The wedding of Peleus and Thetis works exactly that way. On the surface, it is a family event, the marriage that will produce Achilles. Underneath, it is the first moment in the Trojan story when the gods stop acting together and start competing. It is also the first sign that Troy will not be destroyed only by human pride or human error. Divine choice will shape what happens long before the first spear is thrown. The apple also shows something important about Greek ideas of honor. It is not only about appearance in the modern sense. To be called fairest is to be preferred, and to be preferred is to have power over rivals. Beauty, status, and divine authority are closely tied together. That is why the disagreement matters so much. A judgment about beauty is also a judgment about rank. Once the goddess who receives the apple is chosen, the others must be slighted. In a world like this one, no fair decision can leave everyone satisfied. The contest is not just cosmetic, it is a dispute over precedence, and precedence among gods has consequences for the people attached to them. Later tradition makes Paris the mortal judge who finally receives the burden of that choice. He is often introduced as a shepherd in the countryside, though he is also a prince of Troy in the larger mythic cycle. At the wedding itself, he is not yet part of the scene. The story only points toward him. That delay is part of the structure of the myth. The trouble begins among the gods, but the consequences are reserved for a human being who has to live with them. By the time Paris appears, the divine dispute has already been prepared. His judgment will not create the problem from nothing. It will carry forward an argument that started at the wedding banquet. The wedding, therefore, becomes more than a festive prelude. It is the hidden beginning of the Trojan War. Achilles is connected to it through his mother, and the divine quarrel begins there as well. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite are set against one another, and each will later have a stake in the fate of Troy. The feast at Peleus's house is peaceful only on the surface. In the background, an insult has already been given, a contest has already been created, and the judgment has only been postponed. In later retellings, that postponement is what gives the story its long reach. A slight at a wedding becomes a divine grievance, and a divine grievance becomes the setting for a war remembered across generations. That is why the wedding of Peleus and Thetis stands at the opening of the Trojan cycle. From the quarrel at the wedding, the story turns toward a place where the dispute can be judged. Later tradition sets that judgment on Mount Ida, the wooded mountain near Troy where Paris is tending sheep. He is already marked by uncertainty. In some versions, he is not merely a shepherd's son who happened to be in the right place. He is the child of Priam and Hecuba, exposed as an infant because a prophecy warned that he would bring ruin on Troy. In those tellings, he survives because others take pity on him, or because he is raised away from the city's court. Other versions are less detailed, but they agree on the central point. Paris grows up outside the center of power. He is a prince by birth, yet for a time he lives as a herdsman. That distance matters, because the choice that follows is not made in a palace among counselors. It is made by someone standing between worlds, close enough to Troy to matter and far enough from it to be isolated. Mount Ida is not a random hillside. In Greek and Anatolian tradition, it was a real and familiar landscape near the Troad, and placing the scene there ties the story to Troy's own territory rather than to some distant setting. The mountain becomes a boundary zone, a place where gods can appear and human identities can be tested. Paris's life there matters for the same reason. He is removed from courtly training, but not from Trojan belonging. He has the status of Priam's son without the ordinary education of a future ruler. In mythic terms, that makes him both qualified and unprepared, which is exactly the kind of figure a story of judgment often needs. The ancient sources do not all tell the same version of how the goddesses reach him. In later retellings, Hermes brings Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite to Paris, and tells him to serve as judge in their dispute. Some sources say Zeus wants the rivalry settled in a way that keeps his own hand partly concealed. Others simply present Hermes as the divine guide who delivers the command. What remains consistent is the structure of the scene. Paris is not judging a minor disagreement. He is asked to choose between three goddesses, each offering a different kind of reward and representing a different path of life. The phrasing of the episode matters. Ancient summaries and later poetic retellings often call this the judgment of Paris, but that label can make the scene sound more orderly than it is. It is not a lawful hearing. No human court has summoned witnesses or weighed evidence. The gods have staged a contest in which the decision itself will become part of the cause of the Trojan War. The myth is therefore about more than beauty or personal preference. It is about the dangerous power of a private choice to produce public consequences. The prize is not a single object. The prize is alignment with one divine force over another, and in Greek myth that kind of alignment never stays personal for long. Hera speaks first in terms of kingship. She offers power, rule, and political authority. In mythic terms, she promises the honor that belongs to sovereignty, to public status, to being recognized among the great rulers of the world. Athena offers something different. She promises victory in battle, skill, wisdom, and success in war. Her gift is not comfort, it is mastery, the ability to overcome opponents and to be known for intelligence as much as strength. Aphrodite, by contrast, offers desire. She promises the love of Helen, whose beauty will become central to the later war. The gifts are not equal in substance, but they are equal in consequence. Each goddess offers Paris a life shaped by a particular value: rule, excellence in war, or erotic fulfillment. Different retellings sometimes linger on the wording of these offers, but the larger pattern stays steady. Hera's promise would elevate Paris into the sphere of authority. Athena's would make him a figure of military excellence. Aphrodite's would give him the most immediate and personal of rewards, but also the one most difficult to contain. The myth does not present the choice as if the options were morally simple. Kingship, battle skill, and desire are all powerful aims in Greek literature. What makes Paris's decision decisive is that Aphrodite's gift is tied to Helen, who already belongs to another household and another king. The promise therefore contains the seed of violation before the war begins. The story works because the choice is not a contest of abstract virtues. It is a test of what Paris wants most and what kind of future he is willing to set in motion. Hera's offer would place him among kings. Athena's would place him among heroes and commanders. Aphrodite's would bind him to desire and to the consequences of desire. Paris does not choose the strongest army or the safest outcome. He chooses the promise most directly tied to immediate gratification. Later poets often treat that as weakness, but the older pattern is more exact than that. Paris is not simply foolish. He is vulnerable to the kind of temptation that bypasses prudence. The judgment is often summarized as a beauty contest, but the surviving myth is really about competing claims on the human future. This is also why the scene matters for Troy. Paris is not choosing only for himself. He is the son of Priam, and Priam's house is already under the shadow of prophecy. By choosing Aphrodite, Paris connects the city to Helen, and Helen will connect Sparta to Troy through loss, anger, and the obligation of revenge. The gods do not need to fight the war themselves. They only need to place the right human choice in the wrong hands. In some later versions, Aphrodite flatters Paris or helps him imagine that he can receive her gift without paying the full cost. That is part of the power of the myth. It shows how a reward can also be a trap. The pleasure offered in the moment helps conceal the scale of the consequence that follows, which is one reason the story remains so durable in later Greek and Roman telling. There is no fixed ancient account of how long Paris remains with the shepherds before this encounter. That uncertainty does not weaken the story. It helps explain why he can be both inside and outside the Trojan royal line. He has the blood of kings, but not the habits of a court. Paris's choice in the judgment of Paris becomes the first clear cause of the Trojan War. The scene begins with an apple, but the contest is really about what kind of life Paris will value. Hera offers kingship and rule. Athena offers military success and wisdom in battle. Aphrodite offers Helen, the most beautiful woman in the Greek world, along with the fulfillment of desire. In some versions, the goddesses speak as if each gift could be taken without its cost. The myth does not allow that for long. Each offer points toward a different future, and Paris must choose which future he wants. It is called a judgment because Paris is placed in the role of judge, but this is not a human court. There is no civic assembly or lawful dispute in the ordinary sense. It is a divine contest, and its effects are pushed outward into the mortal world. That is part of why the tale remains so powerful in Greek tradition. A private decision becomes a public disaster. A choice on Mount Ida becomes one cause of the war years later. The older versions do not always tell the scene in exactly the same way. Some emphasize the bargaining nature of the offers. Others stress the humiliation of the losers and the insult that follows. Later retellings often make Paris seem shallow or easily persuaded, because that helps explain how a prince could choose so badly. But the myth does not require him to be foolish in a simple sense. It requires him to be vulnerable to immediacy. Desire is placed before him as something direct and vivid, while kingship and prudence remain distant and abstract. That matters because Paris is already marked, in many traditions, by distance from power. He is associated with being exposed as an infant on the mountain and then living as a shepherd among the flocks. Whether every detail appears in every source or not, the background matters to the logic of the myth. A man raised away from stable authority is less likely to trust a promise of rule. Hera's kingship may be impressive, but it can sound remote to someone who has never securely held power. Athena's gift of battle success is valuable, but it belongs to a world of violence and risk. Aphrodite's gift is more immediate. It speaks to longing, not office. That contrast helps explain why the choice is so consequential in Greek storytelling. The apple is only the visible token. The real issue is that each goddess represents a different kind of human ambition. Hera's offer points towards sovereignty, inheritance, and order. Athena's points towards skill, discipline, and victory won through intelligence and force. Aphrodite's points toward attraction and the bond desire creates between one person and another. Paris is not simply choosing a gift, he is choosing a value system. The myth makes that clear by refusing to present the gifts as equivalent in outcome, even if they are presented as equal in the moment. This is why the judgment of Paris is often read as a story about different kinds of reward. One gift belongs to political authority, one belongs to military excellence, one belongs to erotic desire. Paris must choose not just between three goddesses, but between three ways of understanding what makes life worth pursuing. The myth makes that contrast concrete by attaching the choice to Helen. Aphrodite does not offer love in the abstract. She offers the woman whose beauty will later bind the Greek and Trojan stories together. Helen is not only a reward for Paris, she is the link between the divine contest and the war that follows. In later epic and tragic tradition, she becomes one of the central names around which the whole conflict is organized. The setting also matters. Mount Ida, where the contest is usually placed, belongs to the landscape around Troy. That local setting helps the myth connect divine action to Trojan memory. It is not a far-off heavenly scene detached from human life. It is a place near the city that will later suffer the consequences. Greek audiences would have heard in that geography a warning. The beginning of disaster is already close to home. The judge is Trojan. The prize is Greek. The outcome will divide the two worlds that eventually go to war. In later tellings, Aphrodite sometimes seems to guide Paris's imagination so that he can see the choice as pure gain. That detail is not always present in the oldest summaries, but it fits the wider pattern of Greek myth. Divine gifts often come with hidden consequences, and mortals rarely understand them at the moment they accept them. Paris is shown a version of desire that does not yet include the grief it will bring. He is not told plainly that the woman he chooses will lead to conflict, death, and the fall of Troy. The power of the story lies in that imbalance. The promise is narrow. The result is vast. There is also a social dimension to the scene. Paris is a prince, but he is not yet the ruler of Troy in the strongest sense. In some traditions, he has already been restored to his family after being exposed as an infant, while in others, the details are less developed. Either way, he stands between marginality and status. That makes him useful to the myth. He is high-born enough to matter, but not so secure that he can be imagined as naturally wise. The choice he makes can therefore reflect a weakness already built into the story of his life. When Paris gives the apple to Aphrodite, the decision is final. Hera is rejected. Athena is rejected. Aphrodite is favored in one motion. Paris chooses desire over rule and wisdom, and the path toward Helen, Menelaus, and the war opens. Helen belongs in the story long before the ships gather at Aulis. In later epic tradition, she is the daughter of Zeus and Leda, and she grows up in Sparta, a place tied to kingship, alliance, and marriage among ruling houses. Her life there is never treated as ordinary. Helen is the most beautiful woman in Greek myth, and that beauty gives the story its political force. Whoever won her would gain not only a wife but prestige, legitimacy, and a place in a visible network of kings. The tradition does not give one fixed account of how Helen became Menelaus's wife. Some ancient summaries place her first among a long list of suitors, while others simply assume the marriage. In the broader mythic background, those suitors come from many of the leading Greek houses, which helps explain why the matter becomes so difficult to settle. The stable point across the versions is that Helen ends up in Sparta with Menelaus, and Menelaus becomes the husband whose position must later be defended by the other Greek leaders. In myth, this marriage is not private. It is a public fact that links Argos, Sparta, Ithaca, Pylos, and other royal houses that will soon be expected to act together. This is where the old oath matters. Before Helen's marriage, many suitors had sought her hand, and that rivalry created a problem. If one man won Helen, the others might later challenge him or claim they had been treated unjustly. According to the best-known version, especially in later epic summary and in the tradition preserved in works like the library attributed to Apollodorus, Odysseus proposed a solution. The suitors would swear to accept Helen's chosen husband and to defend him if anyone later tried to take her away. In return, they would be released from direct rivalry. The oath turns a marriage into a shared obligation among major Greek rulers. In some versions, this promise is linked not only to marriage but to the danger of feuding among princes. A contest over Helen could have left the Greek world divided before any foreign enemy appeared. The oath was meant to prevent that by replacing competition with agreement. It is one of the clearest examples in the myth of how personal relationships among kings were treated as matters of state. A marriage could stabilize an alliance, but it could also create a grievance large enough to reach across many households. The oath tries to contain that risk before it grows. The political logic of the pact is as important as its mythic function. It explains why the seizure of Helen does not remain a household dispute between Menelaus and Paris. It becomes a matter for a coalition. Menelaus can appeal not only to grief or insult, but to a remembered bond that the kings themselves accepted. The story treats the oath as binding because it was made in a formal setting and witnessed by the men who would later be called upon to honor it. The war is not caused by desire alone. It is made possible by prior promises and by a culture in which public honor and sworn loyalty could turn a personal loss into a collective duty. Helen's position in Sparta is therefore double. She is a wife within a royal household, and she is also a figure around whom Greek memory organizes itself. In some later traditions, she is less an active chooser than a prize, a cause of conflict, or an instrument of divine design. In others, she has more agency, and her later story becomes more complex. But here, at this stage, the emphasis falls on her role as the person whose marriage already contains the seeds of future war. Menelaus has her, but not in a way that guarantees peace. The oath around him means that if the marriage is broken, the consequences will not remain local. That is why Paris's arrival in Sparta is so dangerous. He is not entering an empty house or a neutral court. He is entering the house at the center of a wider agreement, protected by guest friendship, rank, and memory. Paris comes to Sparta as Menelaus's guest, and that is the point the old story wants to sharpen. In Greek tradition, hospitality was not a polite extra. It was a duty guarded by Zeus Xenios, Zeus in his role as protector of guests and hosts. A man received under that protection was expected to be safe in the house that welcomed him. He ate there, stayed there, and entered a relationship that carried obligations on both sides. That is why Paris's visit matters so much in the Trojan War tradition. He is not simply passing time in another kingdom. He is entering the one setting where trust should mean the most. The story survives in more than one form, and the details of how Paris reaches Sparta are not always the same. Homer and the later epic tradition preserve the broad shape of the episode, but they do not present it in exactly the same way. In some versions, Paris comes as a formal envoy sent on business. In others, he arrives as an admired guest whose rank and appearance are immediately noticed. The outcome is the same either way. Menelaus receives him properly, gives him food and shelter, and extends the protection owed to an honored visitor. The myth keeps that generosity in view because the betrayal that follows is meant to feel heavier for beginning there. This is also why the episode has a public, not just a private, meaning. The bond between host and guest was one of the ways Greek culture imagined order across different households and cities. A violation of that bond did not merely insult one man, it damaged a shared system of conduct. When Paris later leaves with Helen, the offense reaches beyond Menelaus's house. It becomes a wrong done under conditions that should have made wrongdoing least likely. That contrast is central to the moral force of the tale. The setting in Sparta also matters because Menelaus is not just any husband, he is a king, and Helen is his queen. In the logic of epic, that means the household stands for something larger than itself. The palace at Sparta is a place where rank, marriage, and political alliance meet. So when Paris enters there, the story is already balancing personal attraction against public duty. A guest in a king's house is expected to know the limits of the role. He is welcomed, fed, and shown respect, but he does not take what belongs to the host. The myth makes the breach unmistakable by choosing exactly that setting for the act that starts the wider disaster. Helen's role in Sparta is treated differently in different sources, and the tradition does not settle into a single explanation. Some versions emphasize Aphrodite's influence. Others show Helen persuaded by Paris or drawn by desire, or carried along by forces that blur the line between choice and compulsion. Later retellings often sharpen one side or another, but the older tradition tends to preserve the uncertainty. Helen can appear as willing, unwilling, or trapped somewhere between the two. That ambiguity is part of how the myth holds human responsibility and divine interference together. It also allows different poets to think about the same event in different moral terms without changing the core sequence. Aphrodite remains behind the whole episode. Paris has already won her favor in the judgment on Mount Ida, and that decision continues to shape what happens next. The goddess of desire is not a distant background figure here. Her promise has already altered the balance of the story. Paris may be handsome and persuasive, but the tradition does not treat his success as only personal charm. It treats him as someone backed by a goddess whose power is now working through the choices around him. However Helen leaves Sparta, Aphrodite's presence keeps the event from looking like an ordinary elopement. In the poem's moral world, desire is never only private feeling. It is also a force with divine and social consequences. Some traditions pause on the practical setting in Sparta. Menelaus is said to be absent when Paris and Helen are together, and in those versions the timing heightens the sense of vulnerability. The offense happens in the husband's house and in his absence, which makes the breach feel sharper still. Other tellings do not dwell on those details and move quickly toward the departure. The story does not need a battle or a long plot. It only needs the conditions in which desire, persuasion, and divine favor can override the obligations of the house. That is one reason the scene is so effective in later epic retellings. It is brief, but it carries everything that comes after. Helen's departure is remembered in three main ways: as abduction, as willing flight, or as a mixture of both. Ancient audiences were familiar with that kind of uncertainty. Myth could preserve the feeling that something had gone wrong with the rightful order of things without fully deciding how blame should be divided between gods and mortals. If Helen leaves willingly, the story becomes one of desire and consequence. If she is taken, it becomes one of violation and loss. If Aphrodite is understood to be pressing the matter from behind the scenes, then both readings can remain active at once. Later authors will sometimes argue for one explanation more strongly than another, but the tradition itself keeps the options open because that uncertainty is part of the story's enduring power. Paris himself is always more than a private lover in this part of the tradition. He is the son of Priam, a prince of Troy, and the guest of another king. He has already passed through the divine contest that set his path. Now he follows the advantage that choice, promise, and favor have given him. The myth does not need to present him as a conqueror. It is enough that he departs with Helen in his orbit. That single act turns a household offense into a matter that will soon involve kings and armies. In other words, the scene in Sparta is not just the theft or flight of a woman. It is the point where a personal decision becomes a diplomatic crisis. Menelaus's humiliation is one of the reasons the episode carries so much weight. In epic culture, the loss of a wife could also mean a loss of honor, standing, and control over one's own house. His marriage has been broken, his guest friendship violated, and his household breached by a foreign prince who was received in good faith. No Greek king could let that pass without consequence. Even before the war begins, the story has already moved from private injury toward collective response. Menelaus is not the only one shamed by what happened in Sparta, because the terms of hospitality were public terms. A breach of Xenia was the kind of wrongdoing that could echo through other households, especially among rulers bound by alliances and old obligations. The symbolism is clear. The guest who should have left with gratitude leaves with the host's wife. The house that should have been protected becomes the scene of an irreplaceable loss. Once Paris and Helen are gone, the damage is no longer only emotional. It is political, familial, and ritual. The offense cannot be repaired inside the house because the house itself has been made into the point of rupture. That is why later tradition treats the visit not as a side episode, but as the moment that makes the larger war feel morally legible. The broken bond gives the coming conflict its first solid cause in human terms, even if the gods have already been working toward it. That is why Paris in Sparta is often treated as the moment when the Trojan War becomes unavoidable. The departure from Sparta is one of the places where the story becomes difficult to hold to a single form. Later Greek tradition often tells it as the theft of Helen by Paris, but even in ancient sources the exact shape of events is not always the same. Some accounts present Helen as deceived by Aphrodite's influence and drawn willingly toward Paris. Others speak more directly of abduction. Still others keep the emphasis on divine compulsion, as though mortals were acting inside a force they could not fully see. That variety matters, because the myth is not only concerned with a private romance, it is concerned with how a household can be broken by choices that are also said to have been guided by the gods. In the most familiar version, Paris leaves Sparta with Helen and with treasures taken from Menelaus' house. The details of the departure differ from source to source, but the result is the same. A guest has crossed the line from welcome to violation. In Greek ideas of hospitality, that line was not minor. It was part of the order that held human relationships together. A host was expected to protect the guest, and the guest was expected to respect the household that received him. Paris had entered Sparta under that protection. Once he left with Helen, the shelter of hospitality had become the setting of betrayal. The emotional loss and the political loss cannot really be separated. Menelaus is not only a husband who has been wronged, he is a king whose authority has been mocked in his own hall. Helen is not only a woman who has been taken or persuaded away, she is also the wife through whom a treaty of marriage, alliance, and honor has been torn open. The story keeps returning to that overlap. In myth, domestic injury often becomes public crisis very quickly, especially when kings are involved. What happens inside the palace reaches outward into the world of oaths, obligations, and armed response. Some versions of the tale make Helen's role harder to define. Ancient poets and later writers do not always agree on whether she goes with Paris from desire, from shame, from divine pressure, or from a combination of all three. Euripides, for example, plays with the possibility that Helen never truly reached Troy in the first place, preserving only a phantom or image there while the real Helen was elsewhere. Other traditions do not go that far, but they still leave room for ambiguity. That is part of the myth's durability. Helen can be presented as participant, victim, prize, or symbol, depending on the author's purpose. The story never becomes simple enough to settle the question once and for all. What is consistent is the scale of the consequence. Menelaus returns and finds not just absence, but an insult that cannot be ignored. The household has been emptied of its most visible bond, and the king's honor has been damaged in a way that touches both private life and public standing. In an ancient Mediterranean setting, this kind of injury mattered far beyond feeling. It called for answer, redress, and allies. A wrong done to one ruler could spread into the obligations of many. That is why the departure from Sparta is not just the end of a visit. It is the point at which a personal breach begins to look like a collective problem. The mythic tradition also treats the moment as part of a larger chain that had been prepared long before Paris arrived in Sparta. Helen's marriage to Menelaus was itself the result of a carefully managed settlement after many suitors had competed for her. The best-known account of that earlier episode comes from later epic tradition, especially the story preserved in the cycle of Greek legend around the Trojan War. Odysseus is often credited with advising Tyndareus to require an oath from the suitors so that whoever won Helen would not be left unprotected if another man tried to take her away. Different versions explain the oath slightly differently, and some later retellings emphasize the political wisdom of the arrangement more than the exact legal form of it. But the underlying idea is stable. Helen's marriage was never only a marriage, it was a binding agreement among powerful families. Once Paris departed with her, that agreement became the lever by which many Greek rulers could be drawn into action. The old oath mattered because it turned a domestic wrong into a public obligation. Menelaus could appeal to men who had already promised support before Helen's marriage was settled. The tradition often names Odysseus among those who had sworn, and his later reluctance to go to war in some versions only highlights how binding the oath was supposed to be. He could try to evade it, but he could not simply ignore it. That kind of detail helps explain why the war becomes so large so quickly in the myth. It is not assembled from nothing. The response has already been prepared by earlier promises, and those promises extend beyond Sparta. The gods remain close to the episode as well. Aphrodite's promise to Paris on Mount Ida does not end when he wins the judgment over the goddesses. In the older narrative sequence, that prize carries forward into Sparta and into Helen's removal from Menelaus's house. Whether the stories imagine seduction, enchantment, or open supernatural compulsion, the point is that Paris bears a divine favor that changes the meaning of his presence among mortals. In some tellings, that makes the act feel less like ordinary wrongdoing and more like the visible result of a quarrel among gods. In others, it does not excuse the offense so much as deepen it. If a goddess is involved, then the consequences are not merely human consequences. They are part of a larger and more dangerous order. That connection to divine action also helps explain why the tradition can never quite settle into a single moral account. From the Trojan point of view, Paris may appear as a prince acting under the promise of Aphrodite, taking a prize that had been granted to him. From the Greek point of view, he is a guest who violates the house that received him and strips a king of both wife and honor. Later authors often preserve both angles without resolving them. The myth does not ask the audience to ignore the contradiction. It lives inside it. Helen can be spoken of as taken, persuaded, or complicit, and each choice changes what the story means. Yet the larger movement of events remains the same. A bond is broken, and the breach radiates outward. By the time Paris departs Sparta, the story has crossed a threshold. The visit is over. The possibility of diplomacy has failed. Once Menelaus loses Helen, the response widens beyond one household. In the mythic logic of the story, this is no longer a private grievance but a matter of obligation among kings. Menelaus turns first to his brother Agamemnon, ruler of Mycenae, and in later epic tradition, the most powerful of the Achaean leaders. Agamemnon is the one most able to summon others, and the surviving poems often place him at the political center of the Greek side, even as they show that authority is unsettled. The old pact among Helen's suitors gives that summons its force. In the version most closely associated with later Greek epic and mythographers, Helen's suitors had sworn to protect the husband she chose and to stand together if she were taken away. The tradition often credits Odysseus with proposing the oath since he had his own reasons to avoid violent rivalry. In that form, the story turns the war from a simple act of revenge into the enforcement of a standing promise. The men are not being asked for sympathy alone. They are being held to their word. There is, however, a difference between the later tradition and the earliest surviving poetry. Homer's Iliad begins after the expedition is already underway and assumes a coalition of kings without explaining every oath in full. Later summaries and mythographers give the oath a clearer shape and make it central to the cause of the war. That later explanation fits a common pattern in Greek myth, where an agreement made before the action begins can bind whole communities long afterward. Once attached to the story, it helps explain why so many rulers would answer one man's injury as if it were their own. Agamemnon then becomes the man who must turn injury into alliance. He does not act alone. He gathers the chiefs, and he sends or receives calls from the leading houses of Greece. The names that cluster around him are familiar from epic tradition: Menelaus, his wronged brother, Odysseus, whose intelligence will matter as much as force, Achilles, the greatest fighter of the younger generation, Ajax, a warrior known for strength and steadiness, Nestor, whose age gives him counsel and memory, and others whose local power makes the expedition possible. These are not soldiers in a modern army. They are rulers whose followers, ships, and loyalties have to be gathered one by one. That is one reason the Trojan War matters so much in Greek memory. It is not simply a duel between Troy and Greece. It is the moment when many independent leaders are drawn into one campaign. The story remembers that coalition as proof of shared identity, but it also preserves how hard it was to create. Every king has his own realm, his own pride, and his own reason to hesitate. The war begins to take shape only because a common pledge can be invoked and because Agamemnon is powerful enough to press the claim. In that sense, the expedition is as much a political settlement as a military one. In some later versions, the gathering of the kings is linked to formal embassy scenes, where Menelaus and Odysseus visit former suitors and other rulers to ask for aid. In others, Agamemnon simply takes the lead as organizer of the expedition. The core idea stays the same. The insult to Helen's husband is being turned into a wider Greek cause, and that cause is now broad enough to draw in the heroes who will define the war's later stories. Later summaries can make this look orderly, as if the kings simply accepted a rightful summons. The older poems suggest something harder. Men are persuaded, delayed, shamed, or reluctantly bound in, and the coalition holds only because refusing the call would carry its own cost. At the same time, not everyone rushes toward the expedition with enthusiasm. Greek myth often gives the war a reluctant beginning, and that reluctance helps explain why the conflict lasts so long. Some leaders are bound by oath, some by honor, some by fear of seeming weak, and some by the pressure of kings more powerful than themselves. The coalition forms because no one can safely stand outside it once the call has gone out. This matters for the poems, where Greece is not a unified nation marching together, but a fragile agreement among rival households. That fragility will matter later, when the same kings quarrel over rank, plunder, and command. Agamemnon's authority is therefore practical rather than absolute. He is the strongest organizer, but he is not the sole source of the war. Menelaus supplies the grievance, Odysseus the remembered oath and the persuasive mind, and the other kings bring the military weight that makes the expedition possible. Agamemnon stands at the center because he can coordinate all of this, not because everyone else has surrendered their independence. Among the leaders drawn into Agamemnon's campaign, Odysseus is the one who most clearly understands what the war will cost. Later Greek tradition remembers him as a king of Ithaca whose value lies in planning, speech, and flexible thinking. That is exactly why the story gives him a hesitation that others do not share. In the cycle of myths around the Trojan War, he is often portrayed as reluctant to leave home for a cause that would draw him into years of uncertainty. A common version says that when the summons to Troy reached Ithaca, Odysseus tried to avoid it by pretending to be mad. He yoked together animals that do not naturally belong in the same labor and began plowing in a confused way, as if his mind had been broken by the call to war. The myth does not treat this as a simple joke. It shows a man who would rather keep his household intact than join a campaign whose outcome was still unknown. It also suits his later reputation. Odysseus is the man who survives through deception, but here that skill is turned inward. He uses the same kind of intelligence that will later help Greece take Troy in order to avoid being taken from Ithaca at all. The deception is exposed through his son. In the traditional story, the Greek envoys do not accept the performance at face value. They place the infant Telemachus before the plow, and Odysseus immediately turns aside rather than harm him. The moment proves that his madness was feigned. It also makes the choice personal. He is not only being asked to join a war, he is being asked to choose between the safety of his household and the collective obligation created by oath and alliance. Once he reveals himself, there is no room left for escape. The disguise has failed, and the role of cautious family man gives way to the role of reluctant warrior. That scene belongs to a larger mythic world in which the Greek kings are already under pressure to honor the oath made years earlier when Helen's suitors had sworn to defend the marriage chosen for her. In that tradition, the pact around Helen is what makes the war possible at all. Menelaus can call on his allies because they have already bound themselves to one another, and Odysseus cannot simply ignore that obligation without weakening his standing among the kings. The story, therefore, works on two levels at once. It explains a personal hesitation, and it shows how royal promises could override private desire in heroic legend. The surviving traditions are not fully consistent on the details. Some tell the episode as a neat display of wit and exposure. Others place more weight on the pressure put on Odysseus by the other kings. especially Palamedes, who is sometimes credited with uncovering the fraud. In later literary versions, Palamedes becomes important because he represents a sharper, more practical intelligence than brute force. The ancient tradition around him is uneven, but the basic point stays the same. Odysseus cannot remain outside the expedition once his deception is uncovered. The Greek coalition has too much authority behind it, and the logic of the oath is closing around him. Some later accounts widen the episode by placing Odysseus at a distance from the war's first movement, as if his resistance were one of the last private attempts to hold back a public disaster. That matters because the Trojan War is not yet the great siege of later epic when this scene takes place. It is still a gathering of kings, a chain of summonses, and a political commitment being turned into armed action. Odysseus's refusal, then, is not just a personal quirk. It marks the point at which the war begins to intrude on ordinary life in Ithaca, where a ruler's household, inheritance, and son stand in the shadow of a conflict launched for a distant foreign marriage. This episode matters because it places Odysseus in the war for reasons that are not heroic in the simplest sense. He does not rush toward glory. He tries to avoid the conflict, and when he is forced into it, he enters as a man already aware that victory will require patience, indirection, and calculated risk. That is why later audiences often treat this moment as a kind of origin for his role in the Trojan story. The same mind that once tried to dodge the expedition will eventually help carry it forward, and then help bring it to an end. Before that happens, though, he must be committed to the journey like everyone else. By the time Odysseus gives up the pose of madness, the Greek cause is no longer just a formal appeal from Menelaus to the other kings. It has become a binding net of obligations, reputations, and old promises. Odysseus is pulled into it because he cannot convincingly stand apart from the rest, and because the world around him will not allow such an exception. The man famous for cunning is now part of the force heading east. From this point on, that intelligence will not serve escape, it will serve the war. The irony is that this same quality, which first appears as resistance, is what later makes him indispensable. In heroic tradition, men are often defined by the kind of strength they can use under pressure. Achilles enters the Trojan War by a very different route from Odysseus. Odysseus hesitates, evades, and calculates. Achilles is shaped by pressure that begins before he can choose for himself, birth, prophecy, and the expectations attached to him from the start. In the oldest Greek traditions, especially the epic material later gathered under the Homeric cycle and the Iliad, he is the son of the sea goddess Thetis and the mortal king Peleus. That parentage marks him as exceptional, not simply a skilled warrior, but a figure whose life is defined by the meeting of divine power and human limits. Later tradition adds details to his childhood, and they do not always fit together. Some accounts say Thetis tried to make him immortal by fire or by dipping him in the Styx. Others place him with Chiron, the wise centaur on Mount Pelion, where he learns hunting, healing, and the discipline expected of a future hero. Another well-known version says Thetis hid him on the island of Skyros by dressing him as a girl among the daughters of King Lycomedes, hoping to keep him away from Troy. These stories differ in detail, but they share the same pattern. Achilles is a child protected by his mother and pursued by a destiny that keeps drawing him toward glory and an early death. They also show how strongly later Greek audiences wanted his upbringing to match his extraordinary status. A hero like Achilles could not begin as an ordinary child. The prophecy attached to him is one of the most important parts of the myth. He has two possible lives, one long and obscure, the other brief but famous. Later retellings state this choice directly, but in Homer the idea already shapes Achilles' own understanding of his fate. He knows that if he goes to Troy, he will win undying fame and die young. If he stays home, he will live longer, but his name will fade. This is one of the central tensions of the Trojan War. It is not only a conflict over Helen or an insult between kings, it is also a story about what kind of life a hero accepts when the price of renown is personal loss. In Greek heroic culture, fame was not a minor reward. It was the nearest thing to survival after death. Achilles is therefore faced with a choice that turns glory into a burden. That choice matters because Achilles is not just a force in battle, he is repeatedly shown as someone who sees the cost before others do. His greatness lies partly in strength, but also in the fact that he understands what strength demands. That is one reason later audiences often treat him as the tragic center of the war. He is the best fighter the Greeks have, yet he is also the one who most clearly knows that the war will consume what is most human in him. His bond to Thetis reinforces that vulnerability. She can warn him, mourn him, and intervene for him, but she cannot remove the prophecy. Divine parentage does not spare him. In the Iliad, that knowledge is not abstract. Achilles speaks as someone who knows the terms of his own future, and the poem places that awareness at the center of his anger and his choices. When the Greek leaders begin gathering for the expedition, Achilles is still young. Some traditions place him hidden at Skyros, while others assume he has already been raised and trained openly. However, the story is arranged, the result is the same. The Greeks need him because no one else matches his speed, skill, and force. His later role in the war depends on that reputation, but the reputation is not mere exaggeration. The Iliad treats him as the most formidable of the Achaeans, and the other kings speak of him as a man whose presence changes the balance of the campaign. In a war shaped by alliances, quarrels, and long delays, one extraordinary warrior could alter morale and strategy alike. His decision to join the war is therefore both voluntary and unavoidable. In some versions, Odysseus discovers Achilles on Skyros by bringing gifts to the women there, including weapons among the ornaments, and Achilles reveals himself by reaching for arms when a trumpet sounds. In others, there is no disguise seen, only the fact that Achilles goes because prophecy and his mother's warning have already made the terms clear. He will not live long, but if he goes, he will be remembered. That knowledge is part of what sends him east. The Skyros story belongs to later tradition and likely grew from the desire to dramatize his reluctant movement toward war. Even when it is absent, the same logic remains. Achilles is not forced to Troy, but he is not free of the future waiting for him there. There is also a wider political meaning in his entry. Achilles is not just a famous fighter recruited for one campaign. He represents the alliance's best chance of success in a war that is otherwise long and uncertain. Menelaus has a grievance. Agamemnon has authority. Odysseus brings intelligence. Achilles brings the battlefield power that can break a stalemate. Even before he appears at Troy, the war begins to take shape around him. The Greeks are assembling not only a coalition but a hierarchy of roles, and Achilles is the one figure whose strength is so overwhelming that it will later become a problem in itself. That tension is part of his importance in the mythic tradition. He is needed to win, yet difficult to contain once present. This is why his story belongs here, before the fleet reaches Troy and before the first major reversals of the war. Achilles is introduced as a man already marked by loss. The army gathered at Aulis because the kings of Greece had made a commitment they could not easily escape. Menelaus had a grievance that had become a cause. Agamemnon had the standing to lead. The other rulers had bound themselves, at least in later tradition, to follow when Helen's marriage was threatened. But a pledge is one thing, and getting hundreds of ships to move is another. The fleet assembled on the Euboean coast and waited for the final sign that would let the expedition begin, and that waiting became part of the story. In the older epic tradition, especially as later Greeks understood it through the lost Cypria and the surviving summaries of the war cycle, Aulis is where the campaign first meets divine resistance. The Greeks are ready in human terms. The ships are there, the men are there, the alliance has formed, yet the winds do not come. That detail matters because it marks one of the main ideas running through the Trojan War myths. Victory does not depend on strength alone. The Greeks may have the better coalition, but the gods can still delay, redirect, or punish them. The expedition is not a simple military movement. It is a negotiation with powers larger than any king. The cause of the stillness is tied to disputes among the gods. Different sources explain the delay in different ways, but the core pattern stays the same. Artemis is angered, offended, or at least unwilling to release the favorable wind the Greeks need. Some versions say Agamemnon has killed a sacred animal, often a deer, and boasted too confidently about his skill. Others link the problem more broadly to the house of Atreus and the pattern of impiety that hangs over Agamemnon. The exact trigger changes from one retelling to another, but the result is the same. The army remains stranded at Aulis, and the war cannot begin until the divine blockage is addressed. That also fits a broader Greek habit of connecting military events to ritual fault. A bad omen, a broken taboo, or a god's anger could explain why a campaign faltered before it reached foreign ground. In that sense, Aulis is not only a mythic location but also a ritual problem. The fleet is assembled in public, under the authority of kings, yet the decision to sail depends on a sign that no commander controls. Later Greek audiences would have recognized this as a familiar tension. Cities consulted seers before major actions. Armies watched birds, weather, and sacrificial signs. A force could be large and still remain helpless if the divine reading was wrong. At this point, the story turns toward one of its most durable omens, the serpent and the sparrows. In Homer's Iliad, this sign is recalled in a speech by Calchas, the seer. A serpent appears, devours a mother bird and her chicks, and then is turned to stone. Calchas interprets it as a sign that the Greeks will fight for many years before Troy falls. Later versions expand the scene and connect it more directly to the opening of the expedition. The omen does more than predict duration. It also establishes the war's character. Troy will not be taken quickly, and the cost will be spread across a long sequence of losses. Calchas matters because he is the figure at Aulis who can translate signs into decisions. In the surviving epic material, he stands for the uncomfortable truth the army already senses but does not want to hear. The Greeks have gathered, hoping for a swift return of Helen and a restoration of honor. Instead, they receive a message of delay and sacrifice. This is one reason the Trojan War story becomes more than a revenge narrative. Even at the start, it is a tale about interpretation. The same omen can be read as warning, promise, or demand, depending on who speaks for the gods. What follows is the demand that made Aulis famous in later tradition, a sacrifice to appease Artemis and release the winds. Here the story becomes especially unstable because the ancient sources do not preserve the same version. In some accounts, the sacrifice is required because of Agamemnon's offense. In others, the goddess is maintaining a wider grievance. Some traditions make the decision seem inevitable, while others preserve more hesitation around the human choice involved. What remains consistent is that the Greek leadership concludes that the voyage cannot continue without blood. That decision prepares the ground for the sacrifice of Iphigenia, which later tradition places directly after the gathering at Aulis. The moment belongs to the next chapter, but its shadow falls here. The army is stranded by silence. The omen has already warned that the war will be long, and the Greeks now face the brutal possibility that the first price of the campaign will not be paid by the enemy, but by Agamemnon's own household. The expedition has been organized as an alliance of kings, yet before it can sail, that alliance is forced to confront the limits of command, the cost of obedience, and the kind of damage that begins before a single wall is breached. Aulis therefore serves as the threshold of the war in both narrative and symbolic terms. It is where a public oath becomes a practical crisis, and where leadership begins to look less like authority than like the ability to endure what one has set in motion. Agamemnon is the commander, but he is not free. Menelaus has the grievance, but not the army's whole burden. The other kings have chosen to come, but once they are assembled, they are trapped in a collective decision that no one can easily undo. Later Greek writers often treated this as the first clear sign that the expedition against Troy would exact costs from the Greeks themselves before it ever reached the walls of the city. The setting also mattered because Aulis lay at the edge of passage, facing the crossing toward Asia Minor. In practical terms, it was a place where fleets could gather and wait for favorable weather. In mythic terms, that geography made it an ideal place for hesitation. The war depends on movement across water, but the water refuses to cooperate. The ships sit ready while the gods withhold the conditions that make action possible. That pause gives the story its opening shape. Before the famous battles, before Achilles' anger, before the long death toll at Troy, there is this first obstruction, quiet and immovable, at the shoreline. In later retellings, the events at Aulis also help explain why the Trojan War has such a strong connection to sacrifice, omen, and family ruin. Agamemnon's command begins with a domestic crisis, not a battlefield victory. The house of Atreus has already carried older curses and crimes in the mythic background, and Aulis adds another burden to that line. The war against Troy may be the public cause, but the cost begins in private. That is one reason the story remains so powerful in Greek literature. The Greeks at Aulis needed a wind, and the story of Iphigenia begins with the claim that only Artemis could provide it. In the best-known versions, that demand follows some offense by Agamemnon, though older tradition is not always specific about what he did. What matters in the surviving myth is the result. The fleet cannot sail, the army cannot simply disperse, and the leaders gathered under one command are forced into a choice that turns delay into family tragedy. Homer's Iliad, the oldest literary account usually brought into the broader Trojan War cycle, does not tell the episode in full. It assumes that the expedition eventually sails, but leaves the sacrifice outside its main action. The clearer narrative comes in later sources, especially tragic tradition, where Aulis becomes one of the war's moral beginnings. There, Agamemnon must answer to both the army and the gods. As commander, he is expected to secure the expedition. As father, he faces the cost. That tension between public duty and private ruin helped keep the story central in Greek literature. Different versions handle the cost differently. In some, Agamemnon is deceived into thinking that Iphigenia is being brought to Aulis for marriage to Achilles. That detail is especially associated with later tragic retellings where the false marriage pretext sharpens the irony. In other versions, the deception matters less, but the outcome is the same. Iphigenia is brought toward the altar under the pressure of a collective necessity that is easier to describe than to justify. Greek myth often uses that kind of pressure to show how war begins not only with an enemy outside the walls, but with decisions made inside the leader's own house. It also ties the expedition to the house of Atreus, a family already marked by betrayal and vengeance, so the crisis at Aulis does not stand alone. The tradition also divides on what happens at the altar. Some accounts say Iphigenia is actually sacrificed so the wind will rise. Others, including an influential line of later legend, say Artemis rescues her at the last moment and substitutes an animal, usually a deer. In that version, the goddess takes the girl away and leaves the Greeks with the appearance of sacrifice and the practical result they needed. Another later tradition, preserved in some literature, has Iphigenia survive and serve Artemis in Taurus. These stories do not agree, and they likely reflect different local memories and poetic aims rather than a single fixed myth. Euripides, for example, gives the tale two very different afterlives across his plays. Even with those differences, the structure stays consistent. The Greeks do not win the wind through skill or noble sacrifice. They are forced into a harsh bargain. The army wants to sail. Artemis will not allow it without a cost. Agamemnon's authority, which gathered the expedition in the first place, now works against him, because he is the one who must authorize the act. The myth places that conflict at the center. It is not only that a daughter dies, or nearly dies, it is that the war begins by exposing the limits of leadership when the needs of the campaign collide with the obligations of kinship. That is also why the episode mattered for Greek ideas about divine justice. In the mythic frame, a king cannot simply command events into obedience. The gods remain present in the consequences of human ambition, and the first serious crisis at Aulis makes that plain before any ship reaches Troy. If the sacrifice occurs, the expedition is launched with blood already on its foundation. If the girl is spared, the same moment still leaves Agamemnon morally compromised, because the attempt itself reveals what he was willing to permit. Later Greek writers treated this as one of the darkest prefaces to the war, because it explains so much of what follows. Agamemnon does not enter as a simple heroic commander. He begins under a sign of division and pollution. However, each tradition defines that stain. The consequences do not end with departure. In later myth, the memory of Iphigenia returns when Agamemnon comes home after Troy. A house open to the demands of war remains open to revenge, and Clytemnestra becomes one of the clearest figures of retaliation in Greek tradition. That later violence is not part of the Aulis episode itself, but the myth encourages the audience to see the two as linked. A family sacrifice answered by a household killing gives the house of Atreus its tragic shape. The first blood at Aulis does not stay there. It follows the expedition and helps explain why victory, when it finally comes, does not bring peace. That is why the sacrifice, or near sacrifice, belongs so early in the story. Once the fleet can finally sail, the story does not move straight to Troy. Ancient tradition preserves different stops, detours, and first encounters along the way. In the broadest version, the Greek force leaves Aulis together, but the journey is more than a crossing of water. It is the first time this coalition has to act as one army, and the first chance for its leaders to measure one another outside their own courts. That matters because the Trojan War is not only a war against Troy. It is also the moment when many Greek kings are brought under a single command and made to keep moving in the same direction. Some versions begin with a mistake before they begin with a battle. The Greeks, or at least part of the expedition, are said to have landed in the wrong place and attacked a region they had not meant to attack. The details vary, but the point stays the same. The road to Troy was not a clean advance from Greece to the Troad. It involved confusion, local resistance, and a series of violent encounters before the main siege was established. In one line of tradition, the fleet mistakes Mysia for Troy and attacks there, only to be repelled. Episodes like this help explain why the war could be remembered as long and difficult rather than as a single heroic campaign. The Greeks do not simply arrive and surround a city. They spend time finding their target, learning the coast, and testing the lands between home and Troy. Other traditions preserve early raids after the fleet left Aulis, but before the siege settled in. These episodes often serve a practical purpose in the story. An expedition of this size needed supplies, allies, and information, and myth explains that need through attacks on nearby places. Some accounts say the Greeks raided cities in the Troad and the surrounding region, sometimes gaining cattle, food, or captives. These smaller actions do not always receive the same attention as the great names of Achilles or Hector, but they show the scale of the operation. This is not a duel between two men. It is a mobile force moving through a wider landscape, trying to sustain itself while pushing toward Troy. In a Bronze Age setting, that logic makes sense even when the surviving poems are not trying to write military history. A fleet that has left home without a settled base must either be resupplied or live off the land, and the myths often turn that necessity into a sequence of attacks. There is also a deeper reason these stops matter. They remind the listener that the war belongs to a world of coastal towns, islands, and shifting loyalties. Homer's Iliad begins after the expedition has already been underway for years, so it does not narrate every landing or every raid. Later poets and mythographers tried to fill those gaps. In doing so, they often gave the journey a pattern: departure, delay, mistaken attack, recovery, and then the slow approach to Troy. That pattern makes the war feel less like a single event and more like a chain of movements that gradually hardens into fate. It also lets different local traditions place their own region inside the larger epic. A shore, a harbor, or a nearby city could become part of the Trojan cycle if a story said the Greeks had once paused there on the way. For the Greeks, those movements also served another function. They forced the leading kings to keep their agreement. Menelaus had the strongest personal claim, since Helen's removal is the grievance that gives the war its name. Agamemnon, as the dominant commander in most versions, had to hold the coalition together. Odysseus, Diomedes, Ajax, Nestor, and the others each brought their own troops. The voyage is the first stage in which all of these households are translated into one expedition. That translation is fragile. It depends on ships, weather, and leadership, but also on the willingness of proud men to keep following a shared cause. The tradition repeatedly shows that this agreement is not natural or stable. It has to be maintained. Even before Troy is reached, the expedition already contains the tensions that will later divide the camp, from questions of authority to questions of who deserves honor once fighting begins. The sea crossing itself is often treated as an ordinary military movement, but myth gives it symbolic force. Water marks a threshold. Once the ships have left Greece, they are no longer only answering a grievance from home, they are entering a world where the old bonds of hospitality, marriage, and alliance will be tested in another setting. That is why the voyage feels like the true beginning of the war. Even though the war has already been prepared by oaths and sacrifice, the army is now in motion, and motion changes the story. There is no easy way to undo what has been set in place. In many ancient narratives, crossing the sea also means accepting uncertainty. The men can no longer rely on familiar roads, known sanctuaries, or the protection of their own cities. They are exposed to weather, misdirection, and the need to deal with people they may encounter only once. By the time the Greeks draw near to the Troad, the conflict has already changed from preparation into direct encounter. They are no longer assembling. They are no longer debating whether to sail. They are arriving at the land that will receive them as enemies. The coast ahead belongs to Troy's wider world, and the first clashes on the journey have shown that this will not be a simple landing. Troy is not presented in the surviving tradition as an ordinary city on a hill. It is a royal center with a lineage, a household, and defenses that already feel established to epic audiences. In the poems and later retellings, the city belongs to Priam, whose family stands at the center of the Trojan side of the war. Around that household are sons, daughters, retainers, and allies, and among them Hector emerges as the clearest military figure. He is not simply one warrior among many. He is the man most often shown carrying the burden of Troy's survival. The city matters because myth gives it a strength that helps explain why the war lasts so long. Troy is commonly imagined with massive walls, and that image is central to how the story works. The walls mark the difference between a raid and a siege. They turn the conflict into a contest between the Greek coalition outside and a fortified kingdom inside. In Homer, the city is often called well-built or strong-built, and later tradition expands that sense into the image of a place that can endure years of pressure. Whether one treats the Trojan War as history transformed by poetry or as poetry preserving distant memories of late Bronze Age warfare, the fortified city remains one of the story's most important ideas. Troy is not easy to take, and that fact shapes everything that follows. Priam's household gives the city its human scale. The war is not fought against a nameless enemy. It is fought against a king, his sons, his daughters, and the men who defend them. Hector is the most important of those defenders because he combines family duty with public obligation. He is the son expected to stand where others might fail. In the Iliad, that role is especially clear. Hector is the Trojan champion who moves between the walls, the gates, and the battlefield outside. He understands that the city's safety depends on whether he can hold back the Greeks long enough for Troy to survive the siege. Later retellings keep that basic shape even when they shift details around it. This emphasis on the royal household is not accidental. Epic poetry often ties a city's fate to the fate of its ruling line, and Troy is a strong example of that habit. Priam is not only a background ruler, he is the figure through whom the city's continuity is imagined. His many children make Troy feel populous and vulnerable at the same time. When later traditions list names such as Paris, Cassandra, and Andromache, they are doing more than adding color. They are showing that the war presses on an entire house. That is why scenes at the gates matter so much in the Iliad. They are not only military locations, they are places where family, politics, and survival meet. Hector's farewell to Andromache in Homer is one of the clearest signs of this larger pattern, because it joins domestic life to the public duty of defense without separating them. The setting also reminds us that this is a city with a wider political world. Troy is not isolated. It is connected to the Troad and to allies who can be called upon in war. That matters because the Greeks are not approaching a simple fortress with no outside support. They are facing a regional power with its own network of relationships. In myth, that network becomes especially important as the war continues and other champions arrive to help Troy. But even before those later episodes, the city is understood as something larger than a single wall and a single king. In the Iliad, the Trojan side includes not only Trojans from the city itself, but also allies from surrounding regions, a detail that helps explain how the war can continue despite heavy losses. A city with friends can resist longer than a city alone. That regional setting also helps modern readers place the story in the world of the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean, even if the poems themselves do not describe that world in historical terms. Trade routes, shifting alliances, and fortified centers were part of that landscape. The tradition of Troy preserves some of that atmosphere by making the city both local and connected. It has gates, walls, and a ruling house, but it also has a horizon beyond the city where other warriors can arrive. The Greeks, for their part, are not fighting a small village raid. They are challenging a major center with its own political gravity. That is one reason the war feels so difficult from the beginning. Hector's role as defender gives the war its moral balance. Achilles may later become the most feared Greek fighter, but at this stage the story still places Hector as the figure who can articulate Troy's side of the conflict. He is not merely a soldier protecting property, he is defending a city, a dynasty, and the memory of a people. That is one reason his later scenes carry such weight. The poems make him the Trojan hero whose courage is tied to responsibility rather than personal fame alone. Even when later traditions present him differently in some details, that core idea remains stable. Hector stands for the endurance of Troy itself, and his death will eventually feel like a turning point because the city's best defender has been taken away. This is also why Troy's walls matter symbolically. A wall is a boundary, and boundaries in myth are never only physical. They separate home from foreign land, family from violence, and order from ruin. The Greeks have crossed the sea and come to the place where those boundaries will be tested. Outside the walls, they can still hope for a quick victory. Inside, Troy can still believe endurance is possible. The war therefore becomes a long test of whether the city's defenses, human and architectural, can hold against a coalition that has crossed an entire sea to recover Helen. The image of the wall turns the story away from a single dramatic assault and toward a struggle of patience, hunger, loss, and repeated failures. The oldest surviving literary tradition does not give us an archaeological report of Troy's fortifications. It gives us something more influential in cultural terms, a city imagined as hard to conquer. That image may reflect, in a distorted way, the memory of real fortified centers in Western Anatolia, but in the epic tradition it functions as a narrative fact. Troy is not going to fall in a single charge. The Greeks will have to settle in, raid, bargain, grieve, and wait. The walls make that plain from the start. Even where later storytellers add embellishment, the basic structure remains the same. The city endures long enough for the war to become a generation-defining event, rather than a brief expedition. So by the time the fleet is near the city, the shape of the war has become clear. Once the Greeks are established outside Troy, the war does not immediately become the single siege later readers often imagine. In the older epic tradition, especially the Iliad, the opening phase is marked by movement rather than a fixed front. The Greeks have come for Helen, but they also need supplies, allies, and leverage. Troy cannot be taken at once, and the army that crossed the sea cannot simply wait without pressure building inside its own camp. So the fighting begins with raids, local clashes, and efforts to weaken the Trojans by striking the land around the city. That detail matters because a siege is not only walls and duels, it is food, forage, ships, and endurance. The Greek host is large, but it must be fed. In territory it does not fully control, that means ranging outward to seize cattle, take treasure, and pressure nearby communities that may be tied to Troy by tribute, friendship, or fear. Homeric poetry treats this kind of warfare as ordinary. Heroes do not always meet in one decisive battle. They raid, return, divide spoil, and test one another again and again. The struggle becomes a pattern rather than a single event. Some early actions are only briefly mentioned in the surviving poems, while later epic and mythographers add more detail. Greek tradition remembers raids against towns in the Troad and beyond, including places that were not Troy itself but belonged to the same regional world. Those stories help explain how the Greeks could remain at Troy for so long. They were not only waiting, they were stripping the surrounding area of resources and trying to reduce the city's support. In mythic time, that is one reason the war can continue year after year. The Iliad begins after this broad stage is already underway, and that is important. By the time the poem opens, the war has gone on long enough for people to be tired, embittered, and divided over status and spoils. The quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles makes sense only in a camp where loot has already been gathered and redistributed, and where prestige depends on who receives the best share. The raids are part of the background that makes later conflicts possible. If the expedition were producing immediate victory, there would be little room for the arguments that dominate the epic. There are also local stories about testing Trojan strength before the main siege settles into its familiar form. In some traditions, the Greeks attack neighboring cities and islands. In others, early engagements help define individual heroes. Achilles in particular is often linked with swift raids and destruction across the region, which fits his reputation as the most dangerous warrior in the Greek camp. These episodes are not always told the same way, and they do not always appear in the earliest sources, but they show how the war expands beyond the walls of Troy. It is a campaign against a wider network of places, not only a single city. That wider setting also helps explain why so many separate names appear in the tradition. A raid on one town may lead to the capture of a woman, a weapon, a ransom, or a hostage, and those small gains can shape the balance inside the camp. In epic society, spoils are not an afterthought. They are evidence of success, and they are also a source of conflict. The story of Briseis belongs to this world of captured prizes and disputed honor. She is not part of a battlefield duel in the strict sense, but her seizure reflects the logic of the raids that define this stage of the war. The same pattern appears elsewhere in the tradition, where victory is measured in cattle, captives, and portable wealth as much as in land held. At the same time, the Trojans are not passive. Hector and the other defenders meet the Greeks outside the walls when they can protect the routes back into the city and refuse to let the invaders turn their landing into a quick settlement. The result is stalemate. The Greeks have the stronger coalition, but the Trojans have the advantage of defense and home ground. The Greeks can hurt Troy, but they cannot finish it. Troy can resist, but it cannot drive the Greeks away. That balance defines much of the war's middle ground. Here, heroic warfare begins to look less like triumph and more like attrition. Men die, but the larger question does not move much. Spoils are taken, but they do not end the conflict. Messages are sent, alliances are tested, and the war settles into the slow logic of exhaustion. Later audiences often remember the duel between Achilles and Hector, the horse, or the fall of the city. But the tradition spends much of its time in this earlier pattern of repeated effort and limited result. Chryses, the priest of Apollo, is the first figure who turns the Greek camp from tension into open crisis. In Homer's Iliad, the trouble begins when Agamemnon takes Chryses' daughter, Chryses, as a war prize after the sack of Chryse. On the surface, this looks like one more standard act in heroic warfare. Victors take captives, captives become spoils, and spoils display success. Homer makes the matter larger than a private grievance. The seizure of Chryses is tied to rank, honor, and the authority of the commander. It also reaches beyond the military camp into cult and ritual, because Chryses is not just a father seeking his child, he is a priest of Apollo, and that office gives his complaint special force. Chryses comes to the Greek ships as a suppliant, carrying ransom gifts and asking for his daughter's return. In the world of the poem, that should have carried weight on its own, supplication was a recognized act, one that placed the request under social and religious obligation. Agamemnon refuses him. Chryses then prays to Apollo, and Apollo answers with a plague against the Greek army. Homer places this response at the start of the poem's surviving action, and that placement matters. The war is not introduced first as a clash with Troy, but as a crisis inside the Greek camp, caused by a failure to respect both a suppliant and a god. Homer describes the plague in a precise and unsettling way. Apollo's arrows strike the animals first and then the men, and the camp fills with sickness and fear. The point is not only that the Greeks suffer, the plague shows that the offense is sacred as well as social. Apollo is punishing disrespect. The army has to face the fact that a captive taken in war has become the cause of divine anger. The fact that the arrows hit animals before men widens the disaster. It is not only soldiers who are affected, but the resources the army depends on. For a campaigning force living from stores, herds, and movement, that kind of punishment threatens survival. At that point, Achilles takes the lead. He urges the Greeks to ask what has angered Apollo and calls for a seer to speak openly. Calchas, who understands the divine will but fears the response of the powerful, explains that the plague will not end until Chryses is returned to her father without ransom. That creates the central problem. The cure is simple in principle, but it requires Agamemnon to give up the prize he has claimed for himself. Homer is careful about Calchas here. He is not shown as a detached prophet. He is a man who knows the gods and also knows the danger of speaking unwelcome truth in front of commanders. The scene becomes more than a ritual diagnosis. It becomes a public test of whether the army can bear the cause of its own suffering. Agamemnon agrees to release Chryses only if he receives another prize in compensation. That demand matters because in the heroic code of the poem, a leader's honor is made visible through the spoils taken in war. To lose a captive without replacement is to lose standing. Achilles objects, and the argument quickly becomes more than a practical disagreement. Agamemnon turns it into a test of authority. If he must surrender his prize, he says, he will take another from among the Greeks. The threat makes clear that the army is being held together by force and pride as much as by shared purpose. It also shows how fragile the system of distribution already is. Spoils are supposed to recognize excellence and rank, but they can just as easily become the language of insult. This is the moment when the quarrel becomes the great opening fracture in the Iliad. Achilles is not defending Chryses out of personal attachment. He is resisting the idea that Agamemnon can treat the best warriors in the army as if their honor does not matter. The poem shows how unstable the coalition already is. The Greeks are at Troy because Paris has taken Helen, but inside their own camp they are repeating the same pattern of seizure, resentment, and retaliation. One leader takes a captive, another demands compensation. A god takes offense. The commander refuses to yield. The result is a breakdown that begins within the Greek ranks. That inner conflict matters for the whole epic because it explains why the Greeks, despite their strength, cannot simply overpower Troy through unity and discipline. Their own hierarchy is already under strain before the major battles unfold. Agamemnon eventually sends Chryses back with offerings, and Apollo's plague ends, but the settlement does not restore peace. Agamemnon then sends men to take Briseis, the captive awarded to Achilles, as his replacement prize. This is the deeper insult, and later tradition often remembers it as the true cause of Achilles' anger. Briseis is not treated in the poem as a simple private possession, but as the public sign of Achilles' honor within the system the heroes live by. When Agamemnon seizes her, he is not only taking a captive, he is announcing that his authority overrides Achilles' distinction in battle. In the logic of the epic, that kind of act cannot remain private. A prize is a status marker, and a status marker taken before witnesses becomes a political statement. Achilles nearly draws his sword. Athena intervenes and stops him, a detail that shows how far the conflict has already gone. The gods do not allow the Greek commander to be killed over the dispute. Achilles restrains himself, but only just. He withdraws from the fighting instead. In military terms, that is disastrous for the Greeks. In the logic of the epic, it is even more serious. The army has lost the warrior who can most decisively alter a battle, and it has done so because its leaders could not settle the question of honor without humiliation. The withdrawal also sets up the long middle movement of the Iliad, where the Greeks struggle without their greatest fighter and repeatedly pay the price for that loss. Later readers often remember this episode mainly as a clash of personalities, and that is part of it. Agamemnon is proud, Achilles is proud, and neither man yields easily. But Homer's version is broader than a personal feud. Patroclus enters the story as more than a companion in Achilles' shadow. In Homer's Iliad, he is the friend who can speak to Achilles with a freedom no other Greek commander seems to have. He is not presented as a second Achilles, and that difference matters. His importance comes from standing between private loyalty and public war. He can see what Achilles' withdrawal is doing to the army, and he can see that pride is now costing Greek lives. Without Achilles, the Greeks begin to suffer badly. The Trojans press their advantage, and the fighting grows more dangerous around the ships. At this point, the war no longer looks like something ordinary leadership can contain. The best Greek warrior is absent, and the men who remain cannot replace him. That pressure creates the opening for Patroclus' appeal. He asks Achilles to let him go into battle wearing Achilles' armor. At first, the request is practical. If the Trojans think Achilles has returned, they may break and give the Greeks room to recover. Patroclus also asks that Achilles' Myrmidons be sent out under his command, so he can drive the Trojans back from the ships. He is not simply asking to fight. He wants to borrow Achilles' authority as well as his appearance. In a world where armor can carry reputation almost as visibly as a name, that is a dangerous substitution. Achilles agrees, but only partly. He allows Patroclus to wear the armor and join the battle, but he warns him not to push too far. The Iliad is clear about the basic shape of the moment, even if later retellings sometimes soften or sharpen it. Patroclus is supposed to save the ships, drive the Trojans away, and then stop. He is not supposed to chase glory. Achilles' caution shows that he understands the risk, and that borrowed honor can become its own trap. The armor itself has a long afterlife in Greek tradition. In the epic, the armor made by Hephaestus is not just protection, it is a sign of excellence, favor, and power. To put it on another body is to transfer more than equipment, it transfers expectation. Trojans and Greeks alike will read the sight of it the same way. Achilles has returned, and the balance of the war may be changing. That is why Patroclus can matter so much in a few scenes. He becomes visible as Achilles before he can remain himself for long. This fits the poem's logic of heroic warfare. Identity on the battlefield is public and legible. A man's shield, helmet, and companions tell others who he is, or at least who he seems to be. Patroclus is not impersonating Achilles in a theatrical sense. He is stepping into a recognized martial role that can alter morale, fear, and command. The Myrmidons follow because Achilles' name still carries force, even when Achilles himself stays in the ships. That makes the episode more than a costume change. It is a transfer of prestige in a world where prestige can move an army. Once Patroclus enters the battle, the story widens. He drives the Trojans back, and the pressure on the Greek ships eases. But in the poem, his success quickly becomes dangerous. Victory gives him momentum, and momentum encourages him to go further than Achilles intended. He presses forward, and the text presents that as a fatal overreach. Patroclus is not simply reckless in a modern sense. He is caught in the heroic pattern where success invites extension, and extension invites ruin. The borrowed armor also helps explain how this happens. It frightens the enemy and reinforces the impression that Achilles has returned. In later traditions, the details of Patroclus' advance and the number of men he kills are sometimes expanded or rearranged, but the Iliad keeps the focus on the turning point itself. The borrowed identity does its work, and then it begins to fail. That failure is built into the setup from the start. Later traditions add other details around Patroclus, including versions with a more complicated relationship to Achilles or a different place in the wider heroic genealogy. Those belong more to later interpretation than to the Iliad's immediate narrative. What the epic emphasizes is simpler and more direct. Patroclus acts out of loyalty and pity, and his loyalty carries him beyond the limits Achilles set. The pity matters within the story because the Greek army's suffering is not abstract. Men are dying near the ships, and the war is threatening collapse if no one intervenes. Patroclus responds to that crisis as much as to Achilles personally. The army he faces is not static either. Trojan support is active, and Hector remains Troy's main defender on the field. As Patroclus advances, the conflict moves toward a direct meeting between the man in Achilles' armor and the man who has made himself Troy's shield. That confrontation has been building for a long time. It is the point where the war's emotional logic finally catches up with its battlefield logic. Achilles has stayed away because of insult. Patroclus goes in because the Greeks are collapsing. Hector stands where the burden of the war has gathered most heavily. Each man is moving toward a decision shaped by forces larger than himself. So Patroclus is not just taking armor, he is taking on a role the poem knows cannot remain temporary. Patroclus dies after putting on Achilles' armor, and in the Iliad that detail gives the episode its force. He is not Achilles, and the poem keeps that distinction clear. The armor gives him authority in the eyes of the Trojans, and for a time it works. He drives them back and relieves pressure on the Greek side. In later versions of the story, Patroclus is sometimes said to go farther than Homer allows, but the Iliad is more restrained. His success has a limit, and once he passes it, the borrowed identity begins to fail. The scene has a clear military logic. The Greeks are under pressure, and Patroclus enters the fight as a temporary answer to a crisis, not a full replacement for Achilles. Achilles lets him wear the armor and join the battle, but he also gives him a warning: drive the Trojans away from the ships, but do not press on to the city itself. That boundary matters. Patroclus is meant to restore balance, not to win the war. The poem builds tension around that limit. The moment he pushes beyond it, he moves from delegated force into danger. In the clearest surviving account, Apollo is the first power to turn against him. Homer does not present the god as a rival soldier. Apollo intervenes from outside the human contest, weakening Patroclus, stripping away his advantage, and leaving him exposed. That marks the point where borrowed identity and battlefield momentum can no longer protect him. He has gone as far as the role can carry him. In the poem's logic, that is where danger begins. It also fits a larger pattern in the Iliad, where human success is often fragile and dependent on divine allowance. Once Apollo has unsettled him, Patroclus is no longer fighting from the height of borrowed strength. The field narrows to the human level, where exhaustion, timing, and vulnerability decide what happens next. Hector delivers the killing blow, but the poem does not treat the death as a simple duel between equals. By that point, Patroclus has already been checked by Apollo and worn down by the fighting. Hector is the final human hand in a chain already set in motion by divine force. Homer gives Hector credit, but not sole credit. The death belongs to the larger pattern of the war, to fate as the poem understands it, and to the dangerous reach of Achilles' armor worn by another man. That armor matters in another way too. Patroclus dies in Achilles' gear, and the scene turns disguise into tragedy. Achilles is absent from the battlefield, yet his presence has been carried there by someone else. When Patroclus falls, that absence becomes visible. The loss is not only military, it is personal, and the poem keeps the two tied together. The armor had stood for Achilles' power, his rank, and the fear he inspired. On Patroclus, it becomes a sign of hope and misrecognition. The Trojans see Achilles and react accordingly, but the body inside the armor is another man, and the gap between appearance and reality becomes fatal. Ancient retellings do not always emphasize the moment in the same way. The Iliad focuses on the sequence of reversal, the advance, the divine interference, the wound, and Hector's final claim. Later summaries sometimes enlarge Patroclus' success, making him seem closer to Troy's fall than Homer does. That broader version increases the tragedy, but it is not the central Iliadic one. In Homer, the important fact is not that Patroclus nearly wins the war. It is that he dies while trying to stand in for the man who refused to fight. Later tradition also tends to sharpen the rivalry with Hector, since Hector becomes the visible enemy who receives the glory and the responsibility. Even there, the poem keeps its focus on Patroclus' broken limit rather than on a clean contest between two heroes. This death changes the story immediately. Until now, Achilles has remained apart from the war because of his quarrel with Agamemnon. He has chosen refusal over participation, and the poem makes clear that pride has kept him inactive. Patroclus' death ends that condition. Achilles does not return because the argument has been settled or because the Greeks have made a better case. He returns because grief makes his withdrawal impossible to maintain. The news does not merely inform him, it remakes his place in the story. The war that had become distant and political suddenly becomes intimate again. That is why Patroclus matters so much in the Trojan cycle. His death turns the war from a dispute over honor into something more personal and more devastating. He enters battle in another man's place and dies in that man's armor. The result is a tragic substitution that changes the direction of the epic. The conflict is still about Troy and the Greek camp, but it is now also about friendship, loss, and the cost of attachment. The poem lets all of those meanings stand together. Patroclus is a battlefield figure, but he is also the emotional hinge of the entire narrative. When Achilles learns what has happened, the tone of the poem shifts with him. Achilles returns to the Trojan War as the poem's turning point. Until now, the Greek camp has been divided by anger, delay, and humiliation, and Achilles has remained apart after his quarrel with Agamemnon. The death of Patroclus changes that. Achilles does not come back reconciled or calm. He returns in grief, and that grief becomes a purpose. In the Iliad, private loss is turned into public action, and the war moves into its most dangerous phase. That return is marked by new armor. Achilles' mother, Thetis, goes to Hephaestus, the god of the forge, and Hephaestus makes a fresh set of arms for her son. Patroclus had worn Achilles' old armor, and that detail gives the exchange its force. The old armor passed through another man's death. The new armor belongs to Achilles alone, and it signals that he is entering the war in a changed state, shaped by loss and by vengeance. Homer uses that change to show that Achilles is not simply resuming his former role. He is crossing into a different part of the story, where the consequences of his choices can no longer be avoided. The armor matters because epic poetry often treats a hero's equipment as part of his identity. A shield or spear is not only practical gear, it also shows rank, favor, and distinction. Hephaestus' workmanship places Achilles in a familiar mythic pattern. A mortal hero receives divine equipment, and that equipment makes his excellence visible. The Iliad lingers especially on the shield, which later readers and artists have remembered because of the scenes of ordinary life described upon it. Harvest, marriage, law, and labor appear beside war itself. But the larger point is simpler. Achilles is being equipped for the final stage of the war, and the craftsmanship suggests that the conflict has moved beyond ordinary human measure. The gods do not remove the danger, they only make it clearer. When Achilles re-enters the fighting, he does not return as a mediator, he returns as a destroyer. The Iliad presents his renewed action as overwhelming. The Trojans are driven back, the battlefield falls into confusion, and the war begins to look one-sided in a way it had not before. Achilles' excellence is total, but it is also dangerous. His strength brings relief to the Greeks, yet it does so without restraint. Grief has hardened into violence, and the poem makes plain that this change is both effective and terrible. The same man who once withdrew in anger now reappears in a form that no one can comfortably welcome. One of the best-known scenes in this part of the poem takes place at the river Scamander, also called Xanthus. The river is not simply part of the landscape. In epic tradition, rivers can be divine powers, and Scamander resists the slaughter by swelling against Achilles. The god associated with the river complains that bodies are filling its waters. Achilles keeps fighting anyway, and the river turns against him more directly. He is nearly overwhelmed by the force of the stream until divine intervention restores the balance. The episode makes a clear point. Even the greatest warrior in the poem cannot act without consequence. Achilles remains superior in battle, but the world around him answers back. It is one of the places where the war seems to press against the limits of human control, and where the poem reminds its audience that battlefield glory also produces pollution, disorder, and strain on the natural world. That matters because Achilles has now entered the conflict in a different way than before. Earlier, his withdrawal set him apart from the suffering of the war. Now he is fully inside it, and the cost is immediate. The Greeks gain ground, but only because Achilles has returned with a force that leaves no room for moderation. He is not merely back on the field. He is back as the most feared fighter in the war, and his presence changes the balance for everyone. The same figure who once embodied Greek strength now acts as a force so extreme that even allies must live with the danger he brings. From here, the story narrows toward Hector. By this stage in the tradition, Hector has become Troy's chief defender. He is not the only Trojan hero, but he is the one who stands most clearly between the city and destruction. Achilles' return makes that role more dangerous than ever. The conflict is now personal as well as political. Achilles is no longer only fighting for Greek victory or against Agamemnon's insult. He is moving toward the man who killed Patroclus. That gives the later fighting a structure that is easy to follow, even when the poem ranges across many names and battles. The war is no longer just a long siege. It is a path leading toward a single reckoning. That detail gives this part of the story its clearest line of cause and effect. The Trojan War has many origins in myth, but here the action is driven by mourning turning into vengeance. The poems and later retellings do not always handle the sequence in exactly the same way. Some traditions pause over different battles or arrange events differently. When Hector finally leaves the protection of Troy's walls, the poems treat the moment as one of the war's most human scenes. In the Iliad, he has a final meeting with Andromache and their infant son, Astyanax, before the duel with Achilles. She urges him to remain inside the city and defend Troy from the battlements rather than meet Achilles in the open. Her argument is practical as well as personal. Walls, towers, and spears from above are the kind of defense a city can sustain when one man cannot. Hector's reply is less a speech of confidence than an acceptance of duty. He knows Troy depends on him, but he also knows his fate may already be closing in. In later reception, this became one of the most familiar scenes in the Trojan cycle because it joins public war to private loss. Hector is not only a prince and commander, he is a husband and father who understands what his death will mean. That domestic scene matters because it shows what the Greeks are about to lose if Hector falls. He is Troy's most reliable defender, the man who has held the line while other heroes have risen and vanished. Priam is old, Paris is unreliable, and many Trojan allies are exhausted or dead. Hector remains the one Trojan hero who can still stand for the city itself. The poems give him a role that is both military and symbolic. He is not simply one warrior among many. He is the figure through whom Troy's endurance can still be imagined. But the same poems also make clear that he is vulnerable to something beyond bravery. Achilles has returned to the fight with a ferocity no ordinary defense can match. After Patroclus' death, the war narrows to a contest between the greatest Greek warrior and the man who killed his friend. The larger war is still there, with siege, raids, and the slow exhaustion of both sides, but it has been compressed into one terrible meeting. The approach to the duel is not simple heroism on either side. In Homer's version, Hector first runs from Achilles around the walls of Troy. That chase is often remembered as one of the most striking moments in the epic because it shows that even the strongest Trojan cannot stand alone against Achilles in his restored rage. The scene also uses the geography of the city with unusual care. Troy is not just a background here. Its gates, walls, and towers define the movement of the combat itself. Hector has already passed from the domestic space of the citadel into the exposed space outside, and now he circles the city as if searching for another path history will not allow. Athena then intervenes by deceiving Hector, making him think a companion will help him face the Greek champion. When he turns to fight, the support he expected is gone. This is a familiar pattern in epic poetry. Human courage remains real, but divine pressure shapes the outcome. The gods do not erase Hector's worth, they make his defeat part of the story's structure. When the duel begins, Achilles has already been marked by the armor Hephaestus made for him. That armor is not just equipment, it signals that Achilles has been rearmed by divine craft after the loss of Patroclus, and it restores him as a force of overwhelming destruction. In the Iliad, this marks a larger change in the balance of the war. Achilles has returned not merely as a soldier, but as a renewed instrument of revenge. Hector, by contrast, stands almost alone. His allies are present in the broader scene, but once the final confrontation begins, the poem narrows the field to the two men whose choices now carry the greatest weight. Some later retellings soften the encounter or rearrange the order of events, but the core tradition is consistent. Achilles kills Hector, and the death becomes a turning point for both armies. Homer presents the scene without ambiguity about who wins, but he does not treat the victory as triumphant in any simple sense. Hector's death ends Trojan resistance in a deep way, yet it also exposes the cruelty of Achilles' grief. The treatment of Hector's body is what makes the episode darker. Achilles fastens the corpse to his chariot and drags it back toward the Greek camp. Later tradition often emphasizes this as the most severe insult in the war. In the heroic world of the poems, burial and funeral honor matter greatly. To deny those rights is to deny a person's place among the dead and to wound the surviving family all over again. The offense would also have been understood in a civic sense, since proper burial was tied to memory, status, and the continuity of a household. Achilles' act is not presented as ordinary battlefield behavior. It is excess, driven by mourning and fury. The poem lets the audience see both the grief that caused it and the offense it creates. Even though Hector had been the enemy, the violence done to his body crosses a line that the narrative itself marks as destructive and unstable. Even here, the tradition is not entirely fixed. Some later accounts and artistic versions dwell more on the emotional confrontation between Achilles and Priam that will follow, while others focus on the physical dishonor as the final expression of Achilles' wrath. Vase paintings, epic summaries, and later poets all preserve pieces of the episode, but they do not always stress the same detail. Still, the older narrative line is clear enough. Hector dies outside Troy's gates. Hector's funeral begins when Priam enters the Greek camp to ask Achilles for his son's body. In the Iliad, this is one of the poem's hardest scenes. Priam does not come as a king backed by power. He comes as an old father, standing before the man who killed Hector and trusting that ritual duty will still matter. The plea is not military, it is human, and in the poem's world that makes it more demanding. The scene brings together two figures marked by grief at the end of the war. Achilles has refused Hector burial, leaving the body exposed and dishonored. In Greek heroic custom, that is a serious violation. To withhold burial is not only to punish an enemy, it denies the dead the honor needed for mourning and for the community's return to order. Priam asks for more than a corpse. He asks Achilles to release the body and to recognize limits that still bind enemies in the face of death. Achilles' response is tied to his own loss. He is not suddenly reconciled to anything. Priam's presence recalls his father and forces him to see a pattern war usually hides. Every man who takes a son may one day be a father in mourning. That recognition does not undo what Achilles has done, but it breaks through his anger long enough for him to act differently. He returns Hector's body. The gesture matters because it reverses his conduct at the end of the poem. Hector is no longer a trophy. He is again Priam's son, Andromache's husband, and Troy's defender. Burial was one of the most basic duties in Greek myth and ritual life. Customs varied from place to place, and later retellings could stress different details, but the core expectation is stable. The dead should be washed, prepared, lamented, and laid to rest. That sequence lets the family acknowledge loss and the community recognize that the dead have been properly released from the world of the living. In the Iliad, Priam's supplication restores that order for a brief time. It gives Troy the right to mourn again. It also draws a boundary around the war, reminding the audience that even an enemy's body is not meant to remain forever, a spoil or insult. When Hector comes home, the poem shifts from combat to lament. Andromache grieves for the husband who protected her and the city. Hecuba grieves for her son and for Troy's failing strength. Helen also mourns him, and her lament is striking because Hector had shown her a respect she does not find elsewhere in the war. These laments are not decorative. They show what Hector meant inside the story. He was not only a warrior, he was a figure around whom household duty, civic survival, and family memory still held together. His death strikes at the home, the royal line, and the city's defense at once. Each mourner sees that loss from a different angle. Andromache mourns the center of her domestic future, the one who might have shielded their son and preserved some continuity in a city under pressure. Hecuba speaks as a mother whose family and kingdom are failing around her. Helen's grief is more complex because she belongs to the conflict that brought the war about. Yet she can still recognize Hector as a man who offered dignity in a world otherwise defined by blame. Together, the three laments make Hector larger than a single heroic role. The funeral rites are described with careful solemnity. Hector is washed, anointed, laid out, and burned on a pyre, and his bones are then gathered for burial in a tomb. In epic terms, this is a full and proper ending, the last honor the living can give him. It also reflects a world in which burial, memorial, and heroic remembrance were closely connected. The Trojan War survives in later Greek and Roman retellings, partly because scenes like this give it moral shape. Glory is real in the heroic world, but so is grief, and the cost of fame falls heaviest on those left behind. That is also why the scene matters in later tradition. The Iliad is not only interested in who wins duels, it keeps returning to what remains after violence has done its work. Hector's burial answers that question in the only way available within the poem, by restoring a human duty that battle had suspended. The dead body is no longer treated as an object of rage, it is prepared according to custom, and custom becomes the means by which the living recover some stability. For Troy, that stability is fragile, but still worth preserving. At the same time, Hector's funeral does not reconcile the war. It marks the last moment in which Troy can still act with dignity and ritual completeness. Hector had been the city's strongest defender, and with him gone, the balance has already shifted beyond repair. With Hector gone, the war does not end. Troy loses its strongest defender, but it still receives help from outside powers, and each new arrival briefly restores the sense that the balance might yet shift. The pattern in the surviving traditions is familiar. Troy is weakened, then reinforced, then wounded again. The sources do not always agree on the exact order of these episodes, but they preserve the same broad shape. The city's champions come and go, and each loss makes the end harder to avoid. One of the best known of these later defenders is Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons. In later epic tradition, she comes to Troy after Hector's death, though the placement of her story can vary. The Amazons were already a striking figure in Greek imagination, often treated as outsiders who lived beyond normal Greek social order. Penthesilea fits that pattern. She is not a minor figure, but a major fighter whose presence signals that Troy's cause is now drawing on the furthest margins of heroic memory. She enters the war with force, wins notice for her courage, and is eventually killed by Achilles. Later authors sometimes linger on the moment of her death because Achilles, after striking her down, is said to see her face and feel sorrow at what he has done. That detail belongs more to later literary treatment than to the earliest war story, but it shows how the tradition kept returning to the tension between victory and regret. Even when Achilles wins, the war does not become clean or simple. Every triumph adds another death to the field. Penthesilea's place in the story also shows how myth could widen a local war into something that felt larger than one city's fate. In Greek art and poetry, Amazons often stand for disciplined foreign courage, dangerous because it resembles heroic excellence while remaining outside Greek custom. That is why Penthesilea matters in the Trojan cycle. She is not only another warrior, she is a sign that Troy's final defenders are no longer drawn only from the city and its immediate allies. The story now gathers strength from distant and exceptional figures, which makes the coming loss feel more complete. If even these outsiders cannot save Troy, then the collapse of the city has a kind of inevitability. Later traditions sometimes focus on Achilles' reaction to her death in order to humanize him, but they also deepen the tragic pattern of the war. The greatest Greek warrior defeats a noble enemy, yet the victory remains shadowed by the sense that excellence on either side only feeds destruction. Memnon follows a similar pattern, though his background is different. He is usually presented as a king from Ethiopia or the Far East, and in epic tradition he comes to help Troy after Penthesilea. His arrival broadens the war beyond the familiar Greek and Trojan families and turns it into something larger in mythic scale. Like Penthesilea, Memnon is a late reinforcement, brought in when Troy has already spent much of its strength. He is associated with great martial skill, and in the versions that preserve this sequence, he too is killed by Achilles. The details of Memnon's story vary more widely than those of Hector or Achilles, which is another sign that the Trojan cycle was never a single fixed text. Later poets and mythographers could arrange the order differently, emphasize different duels, or expand the roles of these foreign allies, but the underlying purpose remains the same. Troy's side is not allowed to fall quietly. Its defense is enriched by figures from the edges of the world, and those figures are then taken away in turn. Memnon's story also helps explain how later epic thought about fame itself. In some versions, his mother is Eos, the Dawn, which places him within a divine lineage and gives his death a broader resonance. Ancient audiences would have recognized the pattern: a heroic son born to extraordinary parentage, brought into a war that is already nearing its end, and then removed before he can change the outcome. That is one reason Memnon became such a useful figure for later storytellers. He allowed the war to feel expansive without changing its result. His presence says the conflict has reached beyond the ordinary borders of Greece and Anatolia, but his fate says that even that enlargement cannot stop the fall of Troy. In the surviving summaries of the lost epic Aethiopis, Memnon's death is followed by a struggle over his body, just as other fallen heroes prompt contests over honor and burial. That detail matters because the Trojan cycle repeatedly treats funeral rites as part of the moral structure of war. To win a corpse is to win the right to remember. To lose one is to accept a dishonorable absence. The war is not just about walls and weapons, it is also about which dead will be recovered, honored, or denied. There are other late war episodes as well, though they are not always given the same prominence. Some traditions include battles involving the sons of Priam, the deaths of additional Trojan allies, and clashes around the walls that show the gradual exhaustion of the city's defenders. The point of these stories is less to introduce a new strategic phase than to show depletion. Troy has already lost Hector, and with him much of its best organized resistance. What remains is courage, kinship duty, and desperate aid from outside. The Greek side, for its part, is also marked by absence and change. Achilles will not live forever, and the war has already shown how much depends on individual heroes. The siege continues not because either side is fully stable, but because neither can yet force a complete conclusion. Each new encounter is therefore both a battle and a measure of what has already been lost. In the tradition preserved by the lost epic Aethiopis, later summarized by ancient writers, Penthesilea and Memnon belong to the period after the events of the Iliad and before the final trick of the horse. That sequence matters because it shows how the wider Trojan story was built from separate clusters of legend. Homer's Iliad is not the whole war. It covers a limited stretch of time, mainly the conflict around Achilles' anger and Hector's death. Other poems, now lost except in summaries and fragments, carried the narrative forward and backward. Later mythographers then stitched those pieces together. So when the story reaches these late allies, it is already moving through a layered tradition: early epic, lost, cyclic poems, and later retellings that tried to preserve the whole arc. Ancient sources such as Proclus's summary of the epic cycle are especially important here, because they show the sequence as later readers understood it, even when the original poems are gone. What all of them agree on is that Troy is running out of defenders. Each new champion gives the city a temporary lift, but none can restore the balance that was broken when its best men began to fall. By the time the story reaches the wooden horse, the war has already lasted long enough to become a test of endurance rather than strength. In the surviving Greek tradition, the horse belongs to the final deception, but the details are not fixed in one form. Homer's Iliad does not include the episode because it ends earlier. The fullest ancient accounts come from later epic summaries, tragedy, and Roman retellings, especially Virgil's Aeneid and the lost cyclic poems as they are known through later writers. Across these versions, the core idea remains the same. The Greeks abandon the appearance of a failed siege and use craft to enter the city they have not been able to take by force. The horse itself works on more than one level. It is presented as an offering, but it is also a hiding place. It has to look large enough to matter and ordinary enough to be believed. Some ancient explanations treat it as a dedication to Athena, the kind of gift a victorious force might leave behind when it pretends to withdraw. Others keep the practical side in view. Men are concealed inside, and the whole structure is meant to pass as a pious token rather than a weapon. In either case, the story depends on the Trojans being persuaded that the long war is over and that what remains outside their walls is harmless. The best-known version gives the idea to Odysseus, whose reputation in Greek myth rests on intelligence, deception, and improvisation. In some accounts, the horse is built by Peleus, a craftsman said to have made it under divine guidance. The Greeks then stage their departure, leaving only the horse, and in some versions a single man behind as a witness. That role is often given to Sinon, whose story becomes crucial in later retellings. He tells the Trojans that the horse is an offering intended to secure safe return home, and that the Greeks have made it too large to take into the city because they fear its power would protect Troy if it were brought inside. The tale is carefully shaped to turn caution into self-destruction. The Trojans are meant to think that they will be safer by honoring the object than by destroying it. This is where the older tradition becomes especially important, because the horse is not accepted without resistance. Several figures warn against it. Laocoon, the Trojan priest of Apollo in Virgil's version, famously urges the city not to trust the gift. His warning is often remembered in the later Latin form about Greeks bearing gifts, but the underlying suspicion is older than Virgil. Cassandra also warns the Trojans, and her role fits a broader pattern in myth. She sees the truth and is not believed. Depending on the version, the horse is tied to a divine sign or omen, and that sign is read in favor of acceptance. The result is a familiar tragic pattern. Knowledge exists on the side of warning, but public judgment follows the story that offers relief. Some accounts make the uncertainty more explicit. The Trojans debate whether the horse should be destroyed, left outside, or brought within the walls. That debate matters because it shows that the disaster is not simple gullibility. The city is tired. Its leaders have lost sons, allies, and time. After years of siege, any sign that the Greeks have left is powerful evidence, and any object left behind can be read as a trophy, a vow, or a token of divine favor. The decision to open the gates is therefore not only a mistake in judgment, it is the point at which exhaustion turns hopeful reading into a fatal one. The tradition lingers on this moment because the fall of Troy needs more than trickery to feel complete. It needs a city that can still argue, still hesitate, and still choose wrongly under pressure. Ancient retellings also vary on how the horse is brought in. Some say it is dragged through a breach in the wall. Others imagine the gates opening for it, as if the city itself were making room for the sign it has chosen to believe. Virgil adds the well-known image of ropes, rollers, and labor, which makes the moment feel ceremonial as well as desperate. The horse is not simply carried into Troy by force, it is received. That detail deepens the irony, because the city takes part in its own ruin by treating the object as something worthy of honor. In a story so often shaped by divine signs, the problem is not that the Trojans have no ritual awareness, it is that ritual meaning has been redirected into a trap. Once the horse is brought inside, the myth moves quickly toward its hidden center. At night, the concealed Greeks emerge and signal to the fleet, which has waited nearby after circling back from its feigned departure. In some versions, the survivors first open the gates from within, making the invasion a coordinated collapse rather than a sudden breach. Either way, the result is the same. Troy is no longer a city under siege from outside, it is being taken apart from within its own walls, by the very act of trust that was meant to end the war. The older summaries of the cycle place the killing and burning of the city immediately after this breach, while later versions elaborate the panic in more detail. The sequence stays consistent: concealment, entry, signal, and then the sack. That is why the horse had such lasting force in later literature. Troy had already resisted force for years, its walls had held against repeated assaults, and the city's defenders had not collapsed in open battle. The final victory does not come because the Greeks suddenly become stronger. It comes because they find a way around strength entirely. The horse is a victory of patience, intelligence, and deception, but it is also a statement about the limits of war itself. If a fortified city cannot be broken openly, the story says, it may still be undone by being persuaded to welcome danger as a gift. That is why later writers remembered the horse not just as a military trick, but as a symbol of catastrophic trust. From there the sack begins, and with it the end of Troy. The surviving defenders are overwhelmed. The gates are opened, and the city that had endured so many losses falls at last through a choice made in uncertainty. In the logic of the Trojan cycle, that is the final irony. The fall of Troy does not end the Trojan War in the surviving tradition. It begins the next part of the story, and that part survives in many forms. Homer's Iliad has not yet reached the sack of the city, but later Greek epic, tragedy, and Roman poetry fill in what comes after. They agree on the broad outcome. Troy is destroyed, the royal house is broken, and the survivors are pushed into lives shaped by exile, slavery, and delayed return. In the familiar versions, Priam is killed inside the city, often at or near an altar. The detail is repeated because it shows how completely normal protection has failed. The old king's death marks the end of Troy as a ruling house. Hecuba is taken into captivity, and Cassandra goes with her. Cassandra had long warned that Troy would fall and was never believed. So her fate became one of the most durable images in Greek myth, true speech ignored until it is too late. Andromache, Hector's widow, is usually shown going into slavery with her young son, though later texts differ on which Greek master receives her. Her story keeps the aftermath grounded in family loss. The fall of a city is not only a military event, it is the breaking of households, kinship, and memory. The sack itself became a central episode in later tradition because it let poets show what victory looked like when restraint had vanished. Greek accounts vary in detail, but they often include the violation of sacred spaces, the killing of the defenseless, and the division of captives among the victors. That pattern matters because it explains why the story was so often retold with moral unease. A triumph over Troy could still look like a collapse of order. In that sense, the sack is not only a conclusion. It is a test of what the Greeks thought war could justify. Helen's fate is less settled. Some traditions say Menelaus takes her back and eventually returns with her to Sparta. Others preserve harsher versions in which she is blamed, threatened, or treated as a figure who brought ruin without ever being reduced to a single moral lesson. Greek and Roman authors did not always agree on how guilty she was meant to seem. That disagreement helped keep her story durable. She is at once a woman pursued by desire, a prize claimed by men, and a symbol of how private actions can spill into public catastrophe. In some later accounts, her beauty itself becomes part of the problem of interpretation because it cannot fully explain the scale of the war, yet it remains inseparable from it in the tradition. Aeneas stands apart because his survival gives the Trojan story a future beyond Troy itself. In many Greek and Roman traditions, he escapes the city, often with Anchises and his son Ascanius. For Greek readers, he is one of the Trojan heroes who outlives the sack. For later Roman tradition, especially in Virgil, he becomes the ancestor through whom Troy's memory is carried into Italy. That is a later development, but an important one. It turns defeat into origin. Troy falls, but it does not vanish. The tradition of Aeneas also shows how flexible the myth had become by the time Roman authors were shaping it for their own culture. His escape could be treated as a survival story, a foundation story, or both at once. The war's aftermath also includes the Greeks who leave the city only to enter new suffering. Odysseus' return becomes the subject of the Odyssey. Menelaus and Helen, in the mainstream tradition, eventually make it back to Sparta, but only after delays and hardship. Ajax the Lesser is often remembered for sacrilege after the fall, and some versions say that offense brings divine punishment on the voyage home. Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, appears in several later accounts as one of the Greeks active in the final violence, and then a recipient of spoils. The returns from Troy, the Nostoi, became their own major cycle because victory did not bring peace. It only opened another kind of trial. This is one of the clearest signs that the Trojan War was never a single story in Greek literature. The end of the siege generated a new body of tales about scattered ships, angry gods, divided households, and homecomings delayed for years. The oldest surviving Greek literary source is Homer, but even Homer gives only part of the larger tradition. The Iliad concentrates on a brief stretch in the final year, centered on Achilles' anger. The Odyssey follows the homecoming after the war. Other epics that once formed a connected cycle, such as the Cypria, the Little Iliad, the Sack of Troy, and the Returns, survive only in fragments and summaries. Later authors knew them through quotation, adaptation, or learned retelling. That is one reason the Trojan War can seem both fixed and unstable. The main figures stay recognizable, but the details between them shift from source to source. Ancient readers could move between versions without expecting a single official account because myth often lived through variation rather than uniformity. Greek tragedy gave special weight to the aftermath by focusing on what the war did to women, children, and broken households. Euripides is especially important here. In plays such as Trojan Women and Hecuba, the sack is treated less as a heroic victory than as a human disaster measured in grief, captivity, and the collapse of civic order. Those plays do not replace the epic tradition, but they show another ancient way of understanding the same material. The war is no longer only about glory. It is about what glory costs. Tragedy also made the audience face the political meaning of conquest. A city under attack was not an abstract backdrop in these plays. It was a community whose institutions, sacred spaces, and family lines were being dismantled at once. The Trojan story also carried local and ritual meaning. Some Greek cities claimed links to participants in the war through places, shrines, or family lines. That mattered because myth was not only entertainment or poetry. It helped explain origins, honor ancestors, and place cities within a shared cultural past. Troy itself was later connected with the site near Hisarlik in modern Turkey, though the relationship between the Bronze Age settlement there and the Troy of Homer remains uncertain. Archaeology suggests that a real late Bronze Age city in that area was destroyed or heavily damaged, but the epic war is not a simple historical report. It is a layered tradition built from memory, place, and imagination. The surviving evidence does not confirm the story as epic tradition presents it, yet it does show that the world behind the poems was not invented out of nothing. That layering is part of why the Trojan War lasted so long in cultural memory. It offered a story about honor, betrayal, alliances, oaths, and the way a single private dispute could become collective ruin. It also preserved images later writers kept returning to: the horse, the walls, the burning city, the grieving survivors, the son who escapes, the woman who returns, the king who does not. Greek authors used the war to think about heroic conduct and divine justice. Roman authors used it to connect their own origins to Troy's fall. The Trojan War does not have one ending, but several shaped by different traditions. In Homer, it belongs to the age of heroes, where glory and loss are inseparable. Later retellings turn it into a lesson about desire, prophecy, and the cost of honor. Helen, Achilles, Hector, Odysseus, Priam, and Aeneas each carry part of that meaning forward. Troy endured because it was never only about a city. It was about the choices that lead people into ruin, and the symbols that survive them: the walls, the horse, the fire, the voyage, the broken home. Across ancient versions, the details change, but the central pattern remains. Great cities fall, witnesses scatter, and myth preserves what history cannot.